unfortunately is often relegated to maybe one section of the political conversation. But I know many of us here realize and understand that this is an issue and a challenge that is central to our lives, central to our community, central to our existence and our future and our national security. I think it's important that we are able as a community, as a society, as a country, to have this conversation in a non-political, non-polarizing setting, because that's the biggest frustration that I see in Washington, is that once you bring up these two words, climate change, depending on the crowd that you're in, you'll either lose a whole bunch of people who are turned off because they see this as a polarizing issue, or you see others who then maybe look down on those who see climate change as something they don't want to talk about. Regardless, both sides are unfortunately, in many cases, drawing lines in the sand without actually breaking this down into what's real and what's important, how this impacts every single one of us. What it comes down to is protecting our environment, protecting our water, our land, our air, this planet that we call home, protecting our future. And how more central of an issue could that be to every single person in this country and every person on this planet? Really, this is central to our existence. So for me, this was something growing up in Hawaii, as the fourth of 5 kids, beautiful place, playground was in the ocean and the mountains and the outdoors. It was never like a political issue. I didn't have to be taught, well, this is something you should really care about, because this is our home. You know, this is our backyard. This is where we spent most hours of the day. And so obviously, it would be important to me just as a person, even as a kid, to say, hey, we got to make sure we protect our home. We got to make sure that, you know, our oceans are kept clean. We don't have plastic debris killing marine life, contaminating our oceans. That we have a safe place. That our outdoor spaces, these precious natural resources we have, are preserved. That we have trees and beautiful parks around us. That we have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. So this is something for us in Hawaii, for us and our family, and even culturally, Native Hawaiian culture in Hawaii, we're brought up understanding, as in many indigenous cultures, that we as people are here as stewards of this planet, caretakers, not to exploit these resources that we have, but here to take what we need to live and survive, but to preserve and protect for future generations. So I'm grateful to have grown up with this upbringing. It's actually what got me involved in politics in the first place. My younger sister is here. Wave, hi, sister. We have 3 older brothers, and of the 5 kids in our family, somehow I was the most shy, most introverted, most happiest with my nose in a book of all the kids. People never believe me when I tell them this, but you talk to anybody who I grew up with, they'll tell you that's true. My little sister was the exact opposite, total extrovert. I studied martial arts. She wanted to be an actress and, you know, a rock star. So she was my spokesperson as kids. Whenever we'd go out, Mom said, hey, go to the grocery store, get some stuff. Like, she would talk to the cashier. She would ask anybody questions. I was totally cool with that. But what really started to get me to break out of my own shell was the protection of our planet. Because I'd go with my friends out to the beach on the weekends, and I started to get kind of angry when we'd see a bunch of trash lying out on the beach every weekend. So we go and we start to pick it up and like, okay, great, the beach looks better. Then come back the next weekend, it's just as bad. So it spoke to a deeper need for change. And so what I did as a teenager, I co-founded a nonprofit called Healthy Hawaii Coalition. And our goal was to really focus on elementary aged kids, to just teach these basic lessons about how there are consequences to the actions that we take. You know, if you're driving down the street and you're eating a bag of chips in the car and you throw the bag out the window, there's a consequence to that. You know, if you've got a garden at your house and you go and you spray a bunch of Roundup and pesticides in the garden, there's consequences to that. Not good for you and not good for your garden. And so what I did to implement this program was I wrote a fun little skit called The Adventures of Water Woman. And naturally, I played Water Woman in this skit. But we took it, and I was Water Woman and Oily Al, day in the life of Oily Al. And it was so incredible because we had 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade kids who were all sitting on the ground looking at us with eager eyes. And Oily Al would go about his day starting to change the oil in his car. He's got this big bucket of dirty oil. He's about to pour it down the storm drain. Water Woman comes in the nick of time and stops him and teaches him about why you don't want to do that, why it's not a good thing. And the really impactful thing that happened for me as we went through these visits to schools all across the state was just seeing that light bulb go off in these kids' eyes. And to see the beginnings of that change where even they could understand at their age why what we were talking about was so important. They connected the dots. That this wasn't a political issue that adults cared about. This is something that we, all of us at every age, can recognize as important to us in a very deeply personal way. And so for me personally, that's what really began my own involvement in politics per se, but really just being an active part of trying to find solutions. It's why I ended up running for the State House of Representatives and later to try to implement a lot of these changes on the city council. We're there when we banned plastic bags in the city and county of Honolulu. Had a big impact, population close to 1 million people. And it's something I continue to be very passionate about now in Congress. I introduced legislation last year called the Off Fossil Fuels Act, which is the most ambitious climate legislation that's been introduced in Congress that really lays out the framework. It lays out an actionable plan for us as a country to make this transition off of fossil fuels, end the nearly $30 billion in annual subsidies that are still going to fossil fuel companies that are profiting like nothing else while taking taxpayer dollars out of our pockets, and instead redirect those resources and making the kinds of big and bold investments that we need to make in clean, renewable energy, in a 21st century green economy. Thinking about not only where we are today, but making these investments knowing that they will best serve our kids and their kids and their kids, generations to come. I think an important component to this is obviously making sure we have the jobs training, that we've got a workforce trained to work in this green energy economy. We're just at the Kirkwood Community College, and the senator here was kind enough to take us around and show us the great work that's being done literally to train a workforce that can get a job today, earn a living wage in a new green economy. An area that I think it's important for us to focus on that's not often addressed is agriculture. Is how our agriculture system in this country and the farm bill that's passed every 5 years really benefits multinational corporations who perpetuate an agriculture system that heavily contributes to the carbon we're emitting in the atmosphere, that heavily contributes to this climate crisis that we're facing. When really, if we look at how we are prioritizing and incentivizing sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, making it so that we have people who love farming, who've farmed for generations, are actually farming in a way that's good for them, good for the soil, and growing food for people in our communities to eat. There's an economic argument to be made, as well as the argument about how we invest in our people and our future. Whether we're talking about the transition from fossil fuels to clean renewable energy, or if we're talking about transitioning our farming away from monocrops and towards growing food in a way that will allow the soil to continue to prosper and allow us to continue to benefit from what's grown in that soil, there's an economic argument to be made every step of the way. The fossil fuel companies don't really want us to know that it's actually cheaper for us to be investing in and getting our energy from clean renewable energy, be from solar or from wind. Of course, they don't want us to know that because they're still getting money from us to subsidize their toxic industry. The national security threat, again, is something connected to climate change that is not often talked about. I think maybe even if it's mentioned, it's not always made clear what the connection there is. Obviously, when we look at how many wars have been waged for the purposes of oil, that's an obvious one. If we are less dependent on foreign countries and their oil and fossil fuels, that creates the independence that we need. But another area that is a great vulnerability that we need to address is our electrical grid and our infrastructure, and how vulnerable it is to rogue actors or foreign actors, especially in this new battle space of cyber warfare, how vulnerable that infrastructure is to penetration or even being shut down. Again, by a rogue entity or a foreign actor. So if we are focusing on empowering communities, getting solar panels on people's roofs, making it so that you are more self-sustainable, then you are lessening our reliance and lessening that vulnerability that we have. We saw just happen in New York just a few days ago, where half the city lost their power. So this is what we're dealing with when we're talking about the kinds of security threats we face, the kinds of environmental threats we face, the kinds of food security threats we face. In really almost every aspect of our lives, we can see the direct connection between why this is something that requires our urgent action and urgent attention. And so this is where, as I talk to folks who are saying, well, because this is such a partisan issue, you're never going to be able to pass legislation like the Off Fossil Fuels Act. But I disagree, because we know that we can make progress when we're not having judgmental conversations saying, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm good, you're bad, I'm pure, you're evil, which is unfortunately the tone that's often used around this issue. How could you not believe that climate change is a problem? Rather than actually saying, all right, you and I are coming from different places, different experiences, maybe different understandings, but let's talk about what we share. Let's talk about what we have in common first, and have that be the basis for our conversation. Relating to each other with what we in Hawaii call as aloha, the aloha spirit, respect, kindness, care, that recognition that we are all God's children, we are all connected, even if we may come from different places or have different ideas. Really, when we gather in that spirit of aloha with that focus on what is in the best interest of humanity, what is in the best interest of the people of our country, what is in the best interest of our safety and security in this country. If we love our country, let's talk about how we can turn that love into action and start at the basics. Every single person here wants to make sure that our kids have a safe place to live and grow up in and prosper. That every American in this country will have clean water to drink. That we'll be able to wake up and have clean air to breathe. These are things that are central to all of our existence. And if we start our conversations there, we will find that agreement, and that allows us to take another step forward, and then another step forward, and then another step forward. And this is how we have to make progress, to make the kinds of big change and big reforms we need to see here in the United States of America, so that we can truly be the kind of leader in the world that we should be. Setting the example through the reforms that we're making here about where we're investing our precious taxpayer dollars. What kinds of energy and agriculture are we incentivizing with our tax code, with our legislation? And then taking that example to the world, leading with a foreign policy that's based on cooperation, not conflict. Saying, well, we may have differences with countries like China and areas like trade. This is an issue that affects us all. So let's work together. Let's talk about how we can collectively take action to address this global crisis, because that is what will be required. Yes, re-entering the Paris Accords is an important first step, but even those who were signatories then knew and recognized that it wasn't nearly enough. It wasn't nearly enough to meet the kinds of targets and the kind of timeline that we need to see in order to stop this threat in its tracks. So this is something that I'm very passionate about, and it speaks to the kind of leadership and the kind of change that I'll bring, not only to this issue, but the kind of leadership that will allow us to address this issue and bring about that change. And that leadership is one that is based on this love of our country and for our people, that will allow us to come together, that will allow us to build those bridges and heal those divisive wounds that have been stoked for so long by people seeking to divide us as a people for their own selfish interests, rather than recognizing that, yes, as a country, united we stand, divided we fall. United we stand, divided we fall. And standing united is how we bring about this positive change that serves every single person in this country. Standing united, we can overcome the hyper-partisanship and the divisiveness and the tension. Standing united, this is how we usher in a new century that promises this bright and prosperous future for everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Gabbard. All right. So if you have some time for some questions, okay, I gotta actually have a couple questions I